Hello everyone, to all our listeners, welcome to today's podcast for the Coaching Outdoor podcast series. Today we are joined by the wonderful Catherine Gorham, who comes to us from Brighton. So Catherine, please could you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Thank you, Alex. Yes, so I'm Catherine Gorham. I'm an independent coach and supervisor. I'm delighted to be here sharing this conversation today. I specialise in working with nature as co-partner, and I've intentionally chosen an image, a virtual background for our conversation, which for those who can't see is actually a bench in the middle of an enclosed woodland area, and it's that kind of sense of being enclosed and being in connection with each other is what I would like to replicate in our conversation today. So that sense of being in tune with the natural world is what opens up my heart, and I'd like to have this conversation from my heart, not just from my head. So I'm bringing all of myself in by connecting with the natural world.
And just thank you for describing that to our listeners. I think we would all much prefer to be sat on the bench together in person, all wrapped up with a thermos of tea or hot chocolate or something, and chatting away. But we are through virtual screens, as is a lot of our lives these days. I've embraced the Zoom backdrop as well for our listeners who can't see, and I've got a bit of dappled light coming through the forest, so slightly different. And it is lovely how you can use these images just to kind of switch things up, and I think you might be talking about that later during our conversation. But just to kind of kick things off, and this is a question that we ask all our guests when they come on, we're really kind of keen to get that sense of kind of backstory and link personally to the outdoors. And it'd be really lovely just to know what your earliest memory of being outdoors is, and why do you enjoy being outside so much?
Yes, thank you. So my grandfather was totally addicted to walking, and from a very young age he insisted that I and my twin sister went to join him every morning for his pre-breakfast walk, and that really became a very early message for me, which I only appreciated later, around the value of outdoor conversations, how different they are from being indoors, because I never shared anything like the same depth or intimacy of conversation with him at any other time apart from when we were walking together. And so what I learned later on in life was that the natural world was the place that I would go to in order to resource myself. And that's what led me to be curious about how I could connect that with my coaching practice.
It is lovely because, as Anna-Marie said, we ask all of our guests that question, and just hearing all the different first memories or the early memories that people have, and quite often they are associated to either a family member, a mum and dad, granddad, etc., and the associations with having time and spending time with that person in nature, or being introduced to nature by that person. And it's just we just love hearing those reminiscences and how much it kind of relates to our backstories as well, and our earliest memories. So in terms of taking that love of nature, and now, as you said, working with nature as a co-partner in your business, what's your backstory? How did you evolve into being a coach that coaches in the outdoors? How did you develop that business?
Well, when I realised that I was actually going out to connect with nature to resource myself, so if I felt stressed or I felt depleted in some way, I realised that actually there was probably a lot more potential to it. So I undertook some ecotherapy training, and it was during my training that I had quite a profound spiritual experience, if you like, and I sensed that nature was offering to be my co-partner in coaching and supervision. And so I always frame my work now around nature inviting me or inviting us into the space, and that deep relationship is how I've evolved nature as a co-partner in my practice. So my own relationship with the natural world has really deepened over the last few years, and I have also become really quite evangelical about coaches who take clients outdoors, understanding the principles of ecotherapy, particularly around psychological safety in taking people outdoors. So if you like, I've mirrored the learning from ecotherapy into my own coaching supervision, and it's also enabled me to have a much deeper spiritual relationship, whilst recognizing that for some of my clients who are interested in working outdoors, it might be a very different way in. It may not be spiritual, it may be ecological, it might be scientific, it could be botanical, it could be anything. So it's about really being curious about what is their relationship, and so that we can meet together in that shared sense, and yet our relationships will be unique to us.
And you've touched on kind of your ecotherapy being a big kind of driver into your coaching backstory. And is there any specific literature that you use to inform your practice as a coach and supervisor within the outdoor space?
Yeah, I mean, I always suggest people start with Martin Jordan's book, which is Nature and Therapy, which covers all the different essential elements around the practical, the psychological, psychotherapeutic, what needs to be taken into account. So I would start there. I also work with the principle of the psychotherapist Buber, who talks about I-thou theory. So what he states is that our sense of identity comes from who we are in relationship with in any one moment. So when I go outdoors, or when I connect with nature virtually, even like I am doing now, my sense of identity of who I am is shaped by being in relationship in this moment. So I'm in relationship with everything around me, and everything around me is in relationship with me. And that sense of almost moving towards non-duality, that my own boundaries are becoming less defined, and I'm merging more with the natural world so that I can be open to the messages that are coming up from the natural world. So that is primarily through Buber's principles, that actually we are not a solid entity, you know, we are in relationship all the time, but it also links to the biophilia hypothesis, that because we're hardwired to nature, our bodies know that, they have that sense of connection, that understanding with what the natural world means to us already. And it's that sense making that we work on a lot with clients, whether it's coaching or supervising, don't we? We help them to make sense of things, and our body understands and makes sense of nature already. So it's such a powerful platform from which to work to do any kind of further exploration.
And taking that kind of a step further and taking into consideration like all the literature and that you've kind of moved through, very much, you know, you're a strong advocate of this kind of slightly unusual title, which is managing the shadow side of coaching outdoors. Oh, I'm just going to have to say that again. Managing the shadow side of coaching outdoors. And that really kind of conjures up, you know, quite a lot of visual images, particularly in my mind, and I'm sure it'll be evoking images for our listeners as well. And what led you to kind of really become an advocate of that? And, you know, just linking back to a term you used earlier, psychological safety, and this is something that we do hear again and again from our guests on the show, is this need for psychological safety. What do you think is particularly important for coaches to be aware of?
Well, I think this has become more paramount since COVID, and more coaches are talking about taking clients outdoors as a mainstream part of their practice, because it's the practical thing to do. And so what I really think is important is that we take heed of the key principles around how to keep a client safe when they're going into an outdoor space. And I'll come on to that a little bit more shortly, but also the principle that we are in a unique time where people are coming to us with might be very specific issues they want to be coached on, but their own backdrop is that they are maybe extra vulnerable because of COVID. They may be, you know, suffering from trauma, from grief, from a sense of feeling so uncertain of what's around, they're destabilized. And so, you know, psychological safety is the business of all of us if we're working with clients. And so we need to be able to hold our clients safely. And so the model that I've developed is called the 3 C's, and it's contracting, containment, and connecting. and I'll talk a bit more about each of those. But primarily, this is about how to hold our clients in a way that feels safe outdoors, and at the same time embracing the huge potential of working with nature. Because my sense is that a lot of coaches think it's coaching plus the outdoors, and that not only carries risk, but it also carries a limiting belief, whereas actually it's so much more than that. And so I wanted to be able to bring the shadow side to help coaches to be able to hold the psychological safety so that clients can bring their vulnerability to the outdoors.
And I know you recently wrote an article for Coaching at Work magazine, and it covers some of these topics that you've mentioned here, and that was the March edition, March 2021. So I would recommend our readers have a read of listeners, sorry, have a read of that.
Thank you.
Just to get a little bit more insight into these topics that you've talked about. And I personally, I'm just going to mention this for people who haven't read it to entice them in. I'm really intrigued by the lighthouse. I have to say, I love lighthouses. I've always had a thing about lighthouses. So for those people who haven't read it, have a little read. There's a great visuals about around a lighthouse. But it would be really interesting to learn and understand your insights into the managing how coaches, we as coaches can manage the risks around what you've mentioned there, around the psychological safety element of coaching, especially in our current context and our current climate. But in general, how can we manage those risks?
Yes, so I'm going to start with containing, because that feels really important, of the first of the 3 C's. So containing is about making sure that our clients have enough capacity to hold their own emotions. And that means they're able to self-regulate, they're able to have a sense of when something feels difficult without going immediately to overwhelm. So if someone has suffered from a trauma in the past, or someone who's showing up for coaching and they're very stressed, they're feeling overwhelmed with work, for example, then it is almost as if they are a container that's overflowing. And if there is a sense of that, then I wouldn't take a client outdoors. Certainly for the first session, I wouldn't anyway, because until you've assessed that capacity for them to hold their own containment, then I wouldn't take them outdoors. But even then, it might be that it needs to happen gradually in order to be able to ensure that sense of containment going forward. So the example I've chosen with this virtual background is an enclosed part of a woodland. So there is a sense of kind of the edges of the container, if you like. And those trees, the vertical holding, provides some of that containment, because there is a sense that there are some edges to the container. And so I would encourage any coach who's taking a client outdoors to think about the kind of landscape that they are taking a client into. So I just want to offer a contrast. If you just bear with me a second, I'm just going to change my virtual background.
And for those people who are listening to the podcast rather than watching it, we will be sharing these backgrounds, these images on our website, so you can actually see and in your own time have a look at the images that Catherine's going to be sharing as well.
So the image that I'm sharing now is a much more open image, with a field with sheep in, and then fields beyond, and then beautiful hills in the background. So that is a much more what I would call uncontained space. There is less holding, there's less structure to hold a client. And we all need to have some sense of where the edges are in our own containers when we're working in a psychological way. So if, for example, I was working in a field that was much more open, I would again be establishing where are the edges of our container for working today, and contracting with that with a client. And it might be that we move beyond and then we recontract as to where the edges might be, but we're really helping the clients feel there is some sense of containment. And the lighthouse article, Alex, that you mentioned, I actually got participants who were coaches to stand right by the shoreline and to look out to sea, and then to stand back right against the back of the beach where there was a kind of a wall that they could hold, or even the lighthouse wall that was holding their back. And they felt a somatic difference in how they were being supported by by the natural world, depending on what was around them as a physical structure to hold them. So those physical structures are still really important, even in an open space. And then the other two C's, one is the C around contracting. So contracting around whatever comes up that's unpredictable, that's something unexpected, or something even internally, because our emotions can come up so rapidly when we're outdoors, can be unexpected. So contracting around permissions for all of that. And then the third C is around connecting, how we connect with ourselves as practitioners, which I would do before I went out for a session, how we connect with the natural world, how we connect with our clients, and how our clients connect with their own relationship with the natural world. And all of those elements need to be factored in order to ensure a sense of psychological safety. And also repeatedly revisited, depending on whatever happens in the moment in an outdoor session.
And just hearing you talk, it really brings kind of home how complex this is. As soon as you start talking about the different layers of relationships, and then clearly you bring kind of context and time into it all, different, when it was happening outside the coaching partnership, and then when you kind of show up, it's just like infinite almost. And yet being outside in nature on one hand seems really simple. So just kind of that simplicity, that complexity, you know, how as coaches do we manage this? What else do we need to be aware of?
Well, I think what's really important is that the first thing we ask is, what is your relationship with the natural world? Because we all have our own unique relationship. And so particularly in these times of COVID, people have developed a deeper connection with nature. So they really want to go outside. And there's that sense of being constrained, isn't there? So many things we're not allowed to do, that actually to get out away from the family or the homeschooling or just get some fresh air feels really appealing. And so with that comes the risk that people associate the outdoors with safety, with fun, particularly if they have associations from their childhood, that it is a safe place to go. And of course, that becomes then a paradox, because at the same time, we're inviting clients outdoors in order to be able to connect with the unconscious. That's why it's so powerful, because it connects so much more easily with the unconscious, which can be raw, it can be unsafe, it can be uncomfortable, and the complete antipathy of actually how they anticipated coaching outdoors to be. So those are the kinds of conversations that need to happen, managing the expectations before you take a step outside, and agreeing that you're going to be constantly checking in with your client as to how they're doing, how does it feel, so that you are tuned into any change in them which requires some kind of quick response, if you like. And I've got a couple of examples I'd like to share, if I may, which really highlight that. So the first one I want to share is actually an event that happened relating to me. So I had to self-regulate in the moment as coach. So I was working with a client who was working in woodland, and the session was going well. The client was exploring some of her relationship with grief, and she was relating to a tree, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, a small, perfectly formed white feather landed at my feet. And I can hear myself getting emotional as I'm reliving this, because exactly the same thing had happened to me when I was planning my grandmother's funeral in my garden 8 years before. And in that moment of the white feather landing at my feet, I was taken back to the grief that I'd experienced with my grandmother. And that was so completely unexpected and unpredictable that I had to, in that moment, do a quick self-regulating exercise to bring myself back into my body, feel the earth supporting me, connecting with that really solid relationship I have with nature, which holds me steady. Because in that moment, particularly given we were working with grief anyway, there was a point at which I was at risk of my own grief overwhelming the presence I was keeping with my client. And so what I actually did was to bend down and to touch some leaves on the ground of the floor of the forest, as a way of me connecting back to my own solid grounding. I didn't mention anything to the client. I carried on, but in that moment I knew that I had to do something for myself. And that's just a very small example. I'd like to go on to a more traumatic example, if I may, in terms of a client. So this was a client who'd come to me with issues around relationships. She found it difficult to relate to people at work because she quickly felt that if she was in conflict, that she shut down emotionally. And that made her feel isolated, which then became a self-fulfilling prophecy because she found it harder to be in relationship with others. And so we spent the first couple of sessions indoors. That was really important, that we started to build a relationship together. And what I noticed was that she had some capacity for containing her emotions, and she really wanted to go outdoors. At the same time, I noticed that she quickly escalated to activating her threat system. So she quickly went to feeling vulnerable or less safe. And so we worked with the fact that actually we'd be going out for session 3 in a way that was very contained, very safe, very gentle, so she could gradually take her own steps, and that we would start her relationship building with the natural world. So session 3 was her finding her space in the woodland, the photo that I showed you earlier. And she took her time to find a place that felt safe and to connect with the senses, and helping her to start to notice which senses soothed her when she was sitting in the woodland. And so I then asked her, how did it feel to kind of open up in her body? And she started to notice a difference, a kind of an expansion as she felt safe in the woodland. And so her homework between session 3 and session 4 was to go away and to practice being in relationship with the natural world in a place that felt safe and contained for her, which is what she did. And she came back session 4, and we talked about the fact that we would go slightly further. So we walked into the field where I'm showing you the picture now. And that was only literally just beyond the woodland. And we agreed we'd walk slowly, steadily, gently, and we'd see how it was for her to be in an area that was more open. How did that affect her relationship with nature? And how did that start to affect her relationship with me? How did that change how open or closed she felt in relationship to me? So we had a really good dialogue going on as we were walking. And then when we walked into this field, we saw a ewe who was really badly injured. And then we saw a notice from the farmer which said that a dog attack had caused 2 ewe deaths, and also some lambs to be aborted. At which point my client burst into tears and said that she'd had a miscarriage 5 years before. And she felt totally overwhelmed with what came up for her, understandably, in that moment. So the first thing that I did was to lower my voice, speak very slowly, very gently, stood close to her, asking her what she needed in that moment, but she wasn't able to answer. So I noticed that in myself, I had a real instinct to tighten that container that we'd created. We'd started to loosen the container. I felt the need to tighten it. So I suggested that we walked back to the woodland and back to the house. And if she wanted to stop at the woodland where she'd found safety and soothing in session 3, then she could do that. Would be up to her. But for us to walk slowly together, with me sensing that she was being held by me, and enabling her to notice her feet connecting with the earth. So slowing down enough to notice her breathing and that connection with the earth holding her. And as we walked back through the woodland, she said she would like to go to that place. So we went back to the place, and she started to calm down as she sat down on the forest floor. And I invited her to do a kinesthetic exercise with feeling, textures, getting a sense of her being held and being in connection. And that took about 15 minutes for her to self-regulate again. And then we started to talk about what had happened. And as we did so, I said, how has it been for you being in relationship with me during this distressing experience? And she suddenly said, actually, I feel more connected with you, because we both shared the distress, we both shared the intimacy, we both saw what happened. And she said, actually, I realise now that when I think about my colleagues at work, they are vulnerable as well. And if I can notice their vulnerability, I can stay a bit more open to my own vulnerability, and thereby stay in relationship. So it was a bit of a graphic story, I'm afraid, but it highlights the unpredictability of what can happen, and how important it is to be able to bring someone back in their own body, into their own body, and into their own sense of relationship with the natural world, whilst at the same time acknowledging where they are and meeting them where they are. And that for me is all about the 3 C's of connecting, containing, and contracting, and repeating that whenever you need to in the moment.
They are some very profound insights and experiences that you've shared with us, and it's great for our listeners to hear sort of live examples, as it were, of how these situations unfold, and how, as a coach, you've dealt with the situations. And thank you for sharing the one of yourself as well, because Anna Marie and I talk about this quite regularly, about, you know, as coaches, getting ourselves ready for outdoor coaching, and our own understanding, our own identification with the natural world, and how we where our love for the natural world comes from, and making sure we are aware of our interaction so that it doesn't overwhelm the situation with our clients. And I was joking, I quite often, if I see nature, and I love nature, I get quite excited about it, and I have to control that in a coaching session, and I have to keep myself under control, so I don't go excited to go, oh look, a red squirrel, or oh look, a white eagle, or something, white-tailed eagle. It's that knowing, and it's that regulation of ourselves as coaches, as you described, but also helping our clients to regulate in those events that may unfold, which probably in the outdoor world there's much more opportunity for unexpected things to happen than maybe in the indoor world, and those are great examples you shared with us there of how those things unfold, and how we can support our clients through those situations. So given you're a supervisor and you deliver masterclasses for coaches, and taking coaches outdoors, what would you recommend as good supervision practices to support this approach? And where can our listeners go to find out more about you and your coaching practice and your supervisionary practice?
Yes, well, I think that's one of the key aspects of supervision for this kind of approach, is to develop that deep attunement to the natural world as coach, as practitioner, because I love what you just shared, that Alex, that actually we are constantly tuning in to all the different channels that nature is offering us in any one moment. And it might be that it's really helpful to say, actually, can we just pause a second and just notice this red squirrel that's arrived, or whatever it is, and wonder what messages that might have for us, or what does that interruption even mean, that something else has come into the space. So I think those moments require judgments from the coach as to, is this a good time to interrupt? Is it something, you know, I should offer in a few minutes time? But actually that noticing when you are also paying attention to what's coming up for me in this moment, what's coming up for me in relationship with my coaching client, all of those levels of tuning in to self are much more, I think, much richer once we have that practice, that daily practice, if you like, of attuning. So I have my own internal supervisor, who is actually a tree, a beautiful oak tree, and every day I go for a walk past this oak tree, and I ask the oak tree, what is my inquiry question for today? What am I going to walk with as a question? And if no question comes up, that's also fine. But it's an opportunity for me to really recreate that deep connection, and also to notice what else is going on in me that I'm holding that I may not have been aware of. And so that, I think, is really important. And whatever supervision support coaches have, I think it's really important that they have nature as a co-partner in that supervision practice, because nature is in that triangle, and it's a kind of equivalent to a three-way coaching conversation. Nature's in there, and therefore that means that nature needs to be in the supervision conversation, because apart from anything else, it's such a powerful way for a coach to access their own unconscious, and that is there present in all of our work. What I would also say is that for me, this work is about a deep truth and authenticity, and that comes from that deep attunement. And the more that we can be really attuned to what's going on in the different parts of us, then the more we can be open to what's going on in our clients. And inviting them to access the different parts of them which are more open when they are in the natural world also means that they can reach that inner truth. And that's what our work, I think, is all about. My website, then, to answer your other question, my website is catherinegorham.co.uk, and my email is catherine@catherinegorham.co.uk. I have also my British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy article on my website, and my Lighthouse article will hopefully be in the public domain for everyone, not only subscribers, by the time this podcast gets published. I also do have a number of masterclasses and supervision groups available, so very interested to have a conversation with anybody who's keen to learn more about how they can deepen their own practice.
Perfect. Thank you for signposting those various resources. And on our website, we've got a resources page that we will kind of link everything to that you've mentioned. And when your episode gets released, there'll be your profile up there with various links to your website. And I'm sure our listeners will be reaching out to find out more about your supervision and masterclasses. So yeah, wow, what an episode, diving into the shadow side of coaching outdoors. And I think 3 C's will be ingrained in our mind: contracting, containment, and connecting. And thank you so much for sharing those real, authentic insights into your coaching practice. I know our listeners love to have that kind of like that fly in the wall, and to actually really be able to put everything in context, and that is what these real life examples do. So thank you for your generosity and openness with sharing them. We would love to kind of get you back at some point in the future. You've got an absolute wealth of knowledge that I think is really important to be able to showcase and our listeners to kind of tap into. So yes, we would love to have you back if you would be willing in the future.
Thank you very much. Could I also say that I really would just want to kind of, I suppose, finish on a kind of a higher note, which is about the examples I've shared are examples for learning. They are quite extreme situations. They are not an average situation. And I just really want to kind of remind people that there is so much that is so powerful about this work, and so moving in a very I found it kind of, I've often been drawn to tears by how much this work really gets to the truth of things. And I want to just share, I suppose, actually, it's beautiful. This work is absolutely beautiful. And I don't want people leaving on a kind of a no, gosh, that felt like a really depressing episode, because I think it's those moments of risk happen because it's such a rich experience of vulnerability and openness, and that's why it's so magical.
And that's and you know, almost the common thread that we notice in our guests is it's the beauty, it's the magic in it, it's our love, it's the energy that you get from it, and all of that is possible because there is that balance, there's that dynamic. As soon as you step outside, you don't know what you're opening yourself up to. And actually, it's that uncertainty, it's that risk, the unexpected could happen. In what is the unconscious going to throw at us? That's part of the beauty. Without it, it wouldn't be possible.
That's right, exactly. Yes. Thank you very much for having me today. I've really enjoyed sharing my my practice and also my guidance around how to do this work with safety. So thank you very much for having me.
And just to put everything together and remind our listeners where you can find our back catalogue of interviews, which we've got quite a few building up now, which is really, really encouraging. And Alex and I will learn so much from our guests. And where to find future podcasts as well is coaching-outdoors.com. So that's coaching-outdoors.com.
So if you enjoyed what you've heard, like it, share across your network, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and LinkedIn community page, the Coaching Outdoor Podcast. Thanks so much in advance for your support.